Welcome back to Are You a Robot? Today we've got a delightful conversation with Lisa and Anne.
It's super great to be here. So my name is Lisa Talia Moretti. I'm a digital sociologist and I am living in London. I'm currently working at the Ministry of Justice and for the UK government. And I'm also an associate lecturer. So I do a couple of lecturing gigs every year at Cardiff University, at Goldsmiths, part of University of London, and at University of Plymouth.
Hi, I'm Anne. It's also really great to be here. I'm an art consultant and experience strategist living in Amsterdam, but I go back and forth between the Netherlands and the US. And I work a lot with different brands and private art collectors on building different art collections and, using artists for different purposes for their companies.
Welcome back to Are You a Robot? This is a series where we aim to explain and tackle some of the greatest challenges within AI ethics, data governance, and related technologies. The way that we're doing that is by gathering the best and the brightest minds in their respective fields to come on here and talk with us about how they are seeing the current state of the world, if there is anything that we should be particularly cautious about, or just a general knowledge dump on what they are doing. I love talking to people about their different passions. And so this is a great way for me to do that. It's an excuse for that. I will mention, though, if you also enjoy some of this AI ethics banter, jump into our Slack channel. We've got a whole community that we're building around these topics. So I would encourage you, look at the link below, click on it, and introduce yourself. Let us know what you're working on and what you're doing, what you're passionate about within the AI ethics space. Okay, before we jump into the full conversation with Lisa and Anne, let's talk about our sponsor, EthicsGrade. They are an ESG ratings company. If you do not know what ESG ratings are, that is where you study the non-financial impact that a company has on the world. Now, EthicsGrade is doing something pretty novel. They are studying the AI ethics programs and data governance programs that these companies have. So you can go to EthicsGrade website and download all of these scorecards on different companies such as Twitter or Facebook or Alibaba, Amazon, you name it. They've probably got a scorecard for them. And you can see which of these companies are actually doing what they say they're doing in their marketing. I find it fascinating because I was actually thoroughly surprised by some of these companies that I found and what they are doing and the ratings that they got from EthicsGrade. So it's fun to play around with, and you get to see what companies are actually doing behind the veil, peeking behind their PR team and looking a little bit deeper. That is at ethicsgrade.io. Go check it out. And without further ado, we're going to be talking with Lisa and Anne.
Are you a robot?
Welcome to both of you. It is very exciting to have you on here. I have been doing a bit of research into seeing is believing, and I think we should start by talking about that and what it is. And maybe, Anne, you can kick this off and let us know, what is this project?
Sure. So, Seen is Believing is a project that Lisa and I had started, I guess, in like late 2018. And essentially, I had been working on my master's degree looking at AI tools and creativity. So, how AI helps or hurts creativity. And as I was doing this research, I kept coming across images of how AI was portrayed in the media. And I was actually taking Lisa's digital research method course at the time and really came to her and said, "This is so bizarre. Why do these images look like this?" And she and I started to really think together of how we could investigate this kind of question and this issue and what that kind of meant, like how we could improve it or what was the feeling around it, which is how this project came to be.
Yeah, so there's a lot of cool stuff that I've been reading up on when it comes to seeing is believing. And you touched on some of it right there, that there's the consistent thread of images that we see. And maybe we should explain to people what that means and what exactly is that consistent thread. I imagine all of the listeners out there kind of know what we're talking about, but it would be great to hear it from you all, the ones who have a bit more authority on this.
So I guess some of the images that we think about, just to start with, are like if you think about the shiny robot, right? The shiny white robots, the shiny silver robots, the glittering brains that tend to be blue and kind of like weirdly connected in this kind of network effect. Those are the kinds of images really that's triggered Anne and I and got us to really, start the research project. Yeah.
Why are they always blue? That's something that I noticed, and I didn't realize it. I didn't consciously know it until I was reading some of your work, and I recognized later, like, yeah, there is normally a blue tint to that. Have you figured that one out yet?
Well, I think, we started looking at color psychology and why certain colors are used in advertising and in marketing to kind of generate a feeling from whatever audience they're trying to achieve. So, red is oftentimes energy. Like, I think a lot of people think of red as urgent and a problem, but it is also something about like energy and awakening. And blue is really about kind of calm and sort of absorbing information at sort of a steady rate, so to speak. So, there's no real scholarship that we have come across that talks specifically about why AI images are blue, but we think it might have something to do with it's this kind of blue is not this neutral color, but it's a color that is very pleasing. It's very easy. It evokes kind of a calm feeling in people when they see it. And so perhaps this is something that's used just to not, be red. So it's not alarming. It's not yellow. It's not alarming. It's this kind of more neutral palette.
And you also start to see blue come across quite a lot in technology companies. So if you think about, like major technology companies and their logos, Facebook, the big blue app, Twitter, the blue bird, think about Microsoft, and very often that like M is written in blue. So, we do see, IBM is another one that uses a lot of blue palettes. So we do see blue as a color being adopted quite a lot within the technology industry, and not just only in advertising, but also in kind of that logo and branding space too. So very much kind of inspired from that extended color palette, I think.
And it is a color also that inspires trust. So in a lot of different studies, blue is also associated with you trust something more, an image more, a logo more, if it actually incorporates blue. I think green was another one, but blue came up the most.
Another thing that I found interesting in one of the papers that you wrote was not only is it the visual aspects of things, but also the way that we talk about the different types of AI and how this can be misleading. And so maybe we can dive into some of the ways that are problematic in how current visualization or just language around AI can be problematic.
I don't know who should start this off, Anne.
I know. I was thinking. Well, I thought maybe for you it speaks, right? Like I think the socio-technical blindness, and then that kind of leads into the visual. So I'm gonna hand that microphone to you for the beginning.
I'll start talking a little bit about sort of the language piece around this. So before Anne and I started working on Is Seeing Believing, I was working on a research paper called It Speaks. And this was looking at the use of language within technologies. And I was particularly interested in the kind of biases that appear within large language data sets that are then going on to train chatbots and voice-activated AI. And one of the things that came through as one of the findings in that paper is the kind of language that we use within technology teams, and the way that very often when you have multidisciplinary teams working together, one of the kind of core challenges is finding a common language that you can talk about the technology and talk about the problem that you're working on, that both teams understand. So for a very long time, technology for decades has been really rooted in science and technology. It's been really rooted in I'm going to go back and say it again. So for decades, for a very long time, technology has really been rooted in science, engineering, maths, statistics. And it's only really quite recently where we've seen an influx of the digital humanities. And so one of the things that's really quite interesting working with multidisciplinary teams is seeing how the digital humanities scholars and professionals working with those from a more technical background to come together to kind of work on the same kind of problems, and how very often language stands in the way of actually coming up with a very multidisciplinary, holistic approach to solving a problem. And kind of thinking about this kind of rooting within engineering and science, it's very much that kind of thinking is very much is around reductionist thinking. So taking a really big problem and reducing it and reducing it and reducing it into smaller parts in order to analyze and test and work on experiments. And working on that kind of language piece and then coming into Is Believing, I started to see the same kind of pattern emerge, where what people were doing is taking a really complex topic like artificial intelligence and tackling it, first of all, from a very scientific maths, statistics kind of approach. But then secondly, that kind of next layer, reducing this very complex technology, this very complex system, into this very reductionist approach. So taking something like as complex as AI and then saying, cool, here's a photo of like a shiny blue brain, or here's a photo of a shiny white robot, right? And I'm going to kind of pause there and hand over to Anne, because she can then talk a little bit more about like the kind of unpacking of some of these images and some of the things that we found within the visual space.
Yeah, I mean, exactly like Lisa was saying, where it was taking these kind of complex situations and boiling it down to an image that are in essence so abstract that they kind of lose meaning in a way. So you've got circuit boards or binary code or blue brains and shiny robots, as Lisa was saying, and in so many instances, there's no context around what this is really supposed to be, or how this technology is used, or what's the task that it's trying to convey. And I think for us, when we're looking at a lot of these, if you look at stock imagery as a whole and how it's chosen, it's really, an art director goes, what is the kind of quickest way to sort of, it's a mix of clickbait, it's a mix of explainability, and talking to, like Getty Images, for example, and this real challenge of we need that clickbait, but we also know that these images are telling nothing. They're sort of this kind of decorative thing that actually isn't producing any meaning. And so when Lisa and I really were looking at that and looking at, that in the context of the research that she had done before and seeing that similarity of this miscommunication, we started really thinking of, well, could we, myself as more of an art director and obviously her as a digital sociologist, come together and produce better images? Or what would be better images for mass media? And that's really where we kind of landed when we started to work on this project and also develop a brief based on the research that we had done to kind of distribute to different artists.
So I find it fascinating what you're talking about when it comes to these large, complex ideas being distilled down into something simple like a photograph, and how much information or how much is lost in that process, and then how we're left with nothing really. As we look at this, we don't get a good sense of what is actually happening and what we should be coming away with. So maybe we can talk about that a little bit more and how that can be problematic and what some dangers are there.
I'm happy to go. Lisa, you can go. It's up to you. I mean, I think some of the harm in that is where's the relatability? right? Like, how are you relating to this image? So if it's this kind of disembodied hand or of a robot, with binary code as a background, what are you supposed to take away from that? So for me, the harm is, people keep associating AI within the sci-fi channels, right? With the Terminator, with what is being done in Hollywood, what's being done in entertainment. And Lisa had come up with a survey, of course, that we had sent out to, anyone, basically, like not a specific audience, but everyone, to kind of ask, how do you feel about AI? What do you think about it? And a lot of the answers from sort of general public were really tied to those ideas that are communicated through entertainment. So I think the harm is, the explainability factor, obviously. I think it's the relatability. I think it's also the, democratization of AI and keeping it within the sphere, like Lisa was talking about, of sort of science and engineering and maths, where actually what I think people don't quite realize is that AI is very much a part of their everyday life. It's in the smartphone that they use all the time. It's, it's completely, it's how they find their directions, you know what I mean, of where they need to go. And you don't really have images that are showing those kind of use scenarios, those sort of tasks. And I think that's where we want to kind of come in and look at how that can be improved.
That's so true. Real fast, before Lisa, you have a crack at it. But it's so funny you say that because, yeah, it's in our maps, or it's how we get recommended things on YouTube or Netflix or whatever. And it's really funny that there's no images of like a robot behind the scenes of a Netflix recommendation engine, right? We never see that. We don't see like ways that they're trying to show us AI is powering what we see on Amazon to buy next. And so whenever we do see AI, it is very much like this, oh, it's going to be like that iRobot kind of archetype, or the brain, as you mentioned before, and somehow it's got circuits around it and it's going to be all powerful. And so all of these images that it portrays are very misleading in that sense, because we're not quite there yet. Like, I don't know if you've had a conversation with Siri recently, but she's great. It's incredible technology breakthroughs, but it's not able to like have a deep philosophical conversation with you by any means. She's barely or it is barely able to figure out, how to set you a reminder on your phone. So maybe along those lines, or Lisa, if you had anything else that you wanted to tag on to what Anne was saying,
Yeah,
feel free.
just to unpack, and kind of echo so much of what we're talking about around, we rely on mass media so much for public education, and when, a really good case in point is like the current COVID pandemic, and how mass media was so instrumental in getting people information about where to go, what to do, how to understand government guidance, things to know about the vaccine, the rollout program. And, there were a lot
changing about the truths every day.
Exactly. And,
Anyway,
so much
sorry.
of our mass media has got so, it's not just, our mass media is not ever just a headline, right? Our mass media comes with images. And we need to really remember that we live in a very visual society where a lot of people are visual learners. And so visuals are important, like visuals are part of the story. And so we don't pay, Anne and I have said many times, like the visuals and around AI is just lazy. There's a lot of lazy imagery, right? Where they're kind of really just reaching for, the kind of lowest hanging fruit, artificial intelligence, cool. Like, let's pull intelligence. So that's going to be a brain, right? Shiny blue brain, cool. Slap that photo next to that headline. And so we, part of the challenge for me is really recognizing and being cognizant of the fact that images are important for public education. And if we don't think carefully about what kind of images we're putting out there, we are actually doing the public an injustice in actually allowing them to become critical thinking, contributing members of civil society to be able to shape the AI narrative and to also start thinking critically about where this technology shows up in their lives.
And how so? Like, how do you mean by that? And especially along the point of the critical thinking, and we're basically taking that from them.
Yeah, so I think a lot of people have come to start to associate, very much to what Anne was talking about earlier. We started to associate artificial intelligence with robotics. And while there are lots of robots that have artificial intelligence within them, that is not the only time that artificial intelligence shows up in your life. And so you are engaging and interacting with artificial intelligence without you even knowing and realizing it. And because we haven't really spent enough time educating the public with the ways that artificial intelligence they are interacting with it and potentially impacting like outcomes in their life, it's very difficult for people to push back against that system or to demand a better service or to raise a complaint or to voice a concern, because you are always, potentially thinking that AI is going to show up as a robot, right? But, it's more than that. So I think if we start, part of like the importance for me of part of producing better images is very much linked to this idea of better public education about this technology. And as a result, raising a more critical thinking public. And Anne, I wonder if now is a good time for you to chat a bit more about like some of the research we did around performative and decorative images and the kind of difference between performative and decorative images and like the role that each of them have played, really.
Well, thank you for teeing that up so nicely. It's a good segue. So yeah, exactly. So when we were looking at images, there's the one side where you look at it from a fine art perspective, right? So we looked at it from an art history perspective first. So the study of signs, the study of semiotics, we noticed interesting / weird things like robots being posed in the positions of the thinker, like Rodin's The Thinker, and references to humanism and the Sistine Chapel and creation and all these kind of weird things. But in any case, looking at it from an art history perspective in fine art is interesting, and how artists create things that they're inspired by is also very interesting. But it also stays sometimes in a very conceptual realm that when you actually want to make it more in mass media, doesn't necessarily have the impact that you want. So we also thought we need to kind of take this out of the idea of the exhibition and really apply to mass media, which is when you start to focus on things like brand design and advertising design and how images are used more in that kind of way versus like in a beautiful white box exhibition. And so we started looking at different, advertising theories and things like that. And we came across literature around performative versus decorative images that really spoke to us because, if you're looking in terms of advertising, like what is a performative image? It's essentially an image where you derive meaning from it. And it's basically like you could imagine telling 1,000-word story out of that image. So, off the top of my head, you can think of really powerful brands like Coca-Cola and the polar bear at Christmas and the kind of, meaning that people get immediately when they look at it of like nostalgia, Christmas, kindness, all these things, without having to say a lot. For decorative images, it's essentially that. It's decoration, it's motif, it's not really something that you're going to get much of we use the word experience nowadays so much, right? Like everyone's looking for an experience and all these kinds of things. But in reality, like this is still what these images are trying to do, is give you some sort of meaning, give you some sort of experience. And decorative images really fall flat in that. And so when we started to look at that terminology and then looking at all these stock images and, things that we were looking at in terms of AI visuals, we started to really see like how so many of them fit into this category of decorative image, and how just historically speaking, and through, if you want to go all academic with it, that's not actually going to have the impact. So then for us, we're like, okay, so we ask ourselves the question of how can we evolve this visual language into something that's more performative, and looking at different case studies and how that's done. And for us, it really came into the kind of artist that we should be working with as well. Like, what's the kind of artist that is trained and skilled at creating performative imagery? Who's skilled at creating powerful visual communication? Who are those people? And for us, actually, it comes into a lot of illustrators. So we see very talented, skilled illustrators for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the BBC, all these different publications that are hired and commissioned to talk about certain subjects or use case scenarios through an illustration, which I think part of the exciting part is it's not just a still illustration anymore. It becomes a GIF, it becomes a video, and this kind of animation. And a lot of these individuals, a lot of these artists are very talented at taking an idea and capturing it in an image. Or maybe it's a series of images, but if we want to think about it in terms of an image. So we started to shift our focus away from, again, this idea of mixed media artists and artists working in all these different ways, and thought, okay, if we want to really create performative images, why don't we focus on artists that are trained in that are historically have done well in that? And that's kind of where we're at now, of discussing this kind of topic with illustrators, getting their feedback as well in terms of what's their experience, how do they get their briefs, and then kind of looking at evolving visuals that are performative in the sense that we're going to focus on more specific context around AI. Like, what's the task we want to talk about? What's the job we want to talk about? Which I think in the end will be more successful. I think it will be more impactful from a visual standpoint.
Yeah, you mentioned something that I continuously talk about, and that's how many different use cases there are for AI right now and how different each one of them is. And like Lisa was talking about, it's very much these days, if you're not really deep in the technology, you come to associate AI and robotics. And those who are in deep in the technology know that there are plenty of use cases without robotics for AI. And so what you're talking about there and giving briefings to different visual artists on different use cases to see how they will create images with that seems much more fascinating and captivating. And like you were talking about, it's taking out that laziness of just slapping on a robot picture or some kind of brain picture. And so, uh, along those lines, too, one thing that I thought about with the whole human media or mass media in general is that simplified narrative that we love to give to everything. And I know that people, when I was working in cybersecurity, everyone that was working in cybersecurity had problems with the hacker being portrayed as a guy in a hoodie.
Right.
And that was the same thing that you would see over and over. And then maybe it would be some matrix code behind them, and it was a lot of green that was being used,
And
right?
like dark sunglasses, right? Like looking down,
Yeah.
dark sunglasses.
Yeah, or you could barely see their face because it was behind a laptop, and it was always a laptop. It was never like a full desktop setup
It was
with a
like
huge
the nerd
screen.
you didn't want to find in the dark alley. That's like,
Yeah.
that was the brief.
Yeah, but I can think about so many different stereotypes or visual stereotypes, I guess we could call them, for so many different things. Like if I think about California, it's the surfing or the beaches, and then you have like all of these simple narratives that get distilled down. They're complex subjects, right? California is obviously not just surfing and beaches, and hackers are not only people in hoodies. And so, and it's much more complex than that, but it gets distilled down into this picture that, as you said, it doesn't really leave us with anything. It doesn't make us think. And it's not actively having us try to figure out what is going on. And so maybe this is a good segue into building these new types of pictures or the visual imagery that you would like to see. What else needs to happen? I mean, you kind of talked about this, Anne, a little bit on better briefings and getting better artists or just artists that are more experienced with this type of thing. But are there other ways that we can try to get a movement started towards not having to see robots all the time when it comes to anything that is talked about with AI?
Well, I can jump in quickly on this because I have two things that come to mind about this for me. One is, and Lisa will definitely, I think you will agree with me on this one. So when we started
I
talking
tend
to
to
some
always agree
organizations
with
and stuff
Anne.
about create, it's the safer way. No, but so I had two comments about that. On one hand, when we would talk to different organizations, and people who are interested in these images, it's like everyone keeps wanting this holistic image, this like golden image of like, okay, we need new images of AI, but actually, can we just create a set of 5 that then we'll use? That doesn't solve our problem. That doesn't solve the problem. So there's no magic one image for AI. Like to your point of like, there's no magic one image for California or whatever. And I think we also have to look at the trends and the times that we live in. Like we were talking earlier, experience is, maybe it's a buzzword now, maybe it's annoying to hear that word, but people are looking for more personalization. They're looking for stuff that is relatable to them, that is going to give them some sort of personal meaning and experience. That's how brands are moving. That's how companies are moving. So this kind of concept of like holistic imagery or one size fits all design and creation, we're already moving past that. So these images for me have to do that as well. And whether that's, okay, we need more budget in order to create more images, or it's working with specific companies to do things that are specific to their audiences. But I think we have to move away from this idea of holistic imagery and one size fits all, because AI is everywhere. It impacts every kind of industry, whether people want to admit it or realize it. That's how that goes. So I think it is a situation of perhaps better briefs to artists, which I think is also bringing them in the conversation. So like Lisa was talking about with socio-technical blindness and all these different departments working together using different language to talk, it's also about the collaborations of the different people who are working in these fields to become more aware of what everything is, right? In order to create things that make sense to more people on a whole. Lisa, do you agree with that? Is that something you would agree with?
I do. I totally agree with that. I totally agree with that. I think one of the kind of biggest things for us to really realize is to really acknowledge the importance of images within the work that we're doing when it comes to reporting on AI and creating AI narratives. And there are two elements of perception. And the first element of perception is about, it helps you understand, right? So it helps with you building your knowledge, it helps with comprehension around a particular topic. But the other thing around perception is around feelings and your kind of emotional response that you get when you see something. So, when we think about images, we need to remember, what we're putting out there in the world is helping people understand this topic, is helping somebody build knowledge about this topic, and it's also creating an emotional, visceral response to this topic, whether somebody will fear something or whether they will start to feel good when they see something, right? So that's the kind of first thing, is this acknowledgement about the importance of images, I think, that needs to happen. The second thing, just to stress the importance of what Anne just said, is around bringing more digital humanities into the technical realm and getting digital humanities scholars, artists, sociologists, anthropologists, creative directors like Anne, getting people working with technologists to get them to better think about how their products are going to land within society. And I don't think technologists can all do this alone, right? And for something I say so often is, technology is not a product, it's a system. We often think about technology as being your phone or a social media app or, these isolated products. But technology is so integrated into our lives that it becomes part of like the social fabric in which we live in. So it becomes part of, the system of knowledge, the system of power, the system of race, etc., all of these things. And the third thing that I think we need to do to build a movement around this is to get people thinking when they are briefing their images, and to build on Anne's point about like how important cultural context is. You're not going to get this like universal AI image. You need to think about the cultural context in which your story is going to land. And then further to that, the thing that we were talking about earlier is, instead of taking this very reductionist approach to visuals, thinking much more about an outcomes-based approach. So what would this technology allow for somebody to do in their life? How could it help shape the future? And thinking about the kind of more long-term effects, as opposed to trying to just report on the here and the now all the time, will help us to shape briefs to artists that will be much more interesting for the artists themselves, but actually much more beneficial for society in the long run.
Oh, I love that, the outcomes approach, and how a creative mind would be able to take that and run with it. And really, it, like you said, it gives the artist something much more interesting and engaging to interact with, as opposed to the here and now, whatever it means for that right now. But let's look ahead in the future and see what else it can do. And so, Lisa, there was something you said before too that I think we should probably highlight here. And you talked about it in your TED Talk too, which I was watching just a while ago. And I thought it is super important to mention this, because when we are lazy with the photos or the images that we use, and then people do not have a good grasp on what exactly this is trying to convey, then there's that disconnect. And then people can't stand up and be part of the conversation. And so maybe you can dive into that and why that's so important.
So first of all, thank you so much for watching my TED Talk. That means a lot to me. I really appreciate it.
That is the gift that keeps on giving. It's so good.
Thank you so much, Anne. It's very kind. This is why we're friends. I listen to Anne and she compliments me.
Yeah.
So this is a topic I feel really, really passionately about. So I feel hugely passionate about the democratization of technology. And I feel really passionately about it because issues and themes around justice, I care a huge amount about. And I sometimes really worry in society that technology belongs to the technologists, and that they have so much power and so much control over the technology that we consume in our lives, and enforce so many experiences upon us that we kind of sleepwalk ourselves into. And then before it's maybe too late, we've actually engaged in some pretty poor behavior. We've developed some really shocking habits, and that are very difficult to kind of reverse and to come out of. And so for me, I think something that I try to do very often in my work, and perhaps this is in the kind of tech ethics space that I work in, is I try to get people talking about and engaging in technology in ways that they feel that they are able to do. So, and the first thing is around language. So simplifying the language so that people feel like, oh my God, like I don't need a BSc degree in computer science, or I don't need a philosophy degree to be able to engage in conversations about technology. And this is one of the reasons I feel so passionately about this project, because you have to meet people where they are in order to get them to care about something. And we need to work harder at doing that, at meeting people where they are, and helping them kind of build up their confidence to engage in a topic. And if we're able to do that, And if we are able to build confidence and build knowledge in a topic that is so important as technology, we will be able to democratize technology a lot more and spread out that power. And society will be able to get a bit more power back and not feel so enslaved by so many of these tech companies. So for me, that's the kind of real importance around this is building confidence and knowledge in a topic that people feel quite isolated from because they don't feel they have the expertise to be able to participate. And for me, I think everyone can participate in this conversation because it's a topic that is so integrated into everyone's life, and you should feel that you have the ability to speak out and to voice concern where there is concern around, or where you feel concerned about how this is impacting upon your life.
I would imagine a lot of times, especially for myself, I feel concerned about XYZ, but I'm not sure where I can voice that. Do you have any recommendations there?
Yeah, that's a great, really, really good point. And I think this is part of the challenge around this kind of topic is people don't know where to go. So very many people don't feel connected to a community or don't feel connected to, a kind of civil action group to be able to raise any concerns or complaints. And I do think that there is a role for governments to play here, to play a much more important role in helping people voice concerns and helping people to be able to help people to be able to get those kind of powerful technology companies to be accountable. And so I don't have a huge amount of resources, unfortunately, to kind of share with people over this call, because a huge amount of resources don't really exist. But, there are organizations like the Mozilla Foundation. There are organizations like Tactical Tech. There are organizations like Ada Lovelace Institute, the Alan Turing Institute, who do a phenomenal job of making sure and kind of like auditing in some ways the technology industry, raising concerns, starting petitions, lobbying governments. Even, people like Black Lives Matter have done a tremendous job of calling out any kind of surveillance technologies and also racial profiling technologies and the impact that has on Black and Brown communities. So there are lots of those kinds of groups where, even though they might not be directly connected to technology, like Black Lives Matter, they are very powerful communities that can actually raise concerns and kind of get them into public spaces so that they can be debated.
Yeah, makes complete sense. And it is very much, I think, we feel like, oh, it's I don't like what Facebook is doing, or I don't like what insert big gigantic tech company is doing, but I don't have any power to change it, because it's either I just delete my account and say goodbye and I don't play by their rules, or I play by their rules and I have to go along with whatever it is they're doing. And so it's interesting that you say that. And I also have felt that before, like when I don't like something and I don't want to be the person who is telling every friend why I don't like it and being like just complaining to my friends, and they're like, yeah, well, that's what you get. That's the world we live in. That's kind of what I'm met with sometimes. And so it's interesting you mentioned, though, the Mozilla Foundation and like the Turing Institute, because those are great projects that are doing some wonderful things. And I'm sure they're open to hearing from the public. And so it's very much like, yeah, maybe next time that I don't like something, I might write somebody on the Mozilla Foundation or the Turing Institute. That's, if I'm really, really upset about it, why not? Right?
Yeah,
It seems more productive than Twitter.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Exactly.
or Reddit,
Complaining
or
about Twitter on Twitter.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, maybe we can talk a little bit more about something else that you all mentioned before, which was the socio-technical blindness. And that term got thrown around in the beginning when we were talking, but I'd like to dive into it a little more just to figure out what is that and why is it important?
I'm going to definitely hold that microphone over to Lisa because she is the expert in the socio-technical
great.
blindness. I've just borrowed her theories for my own stuff.
Yeah. I'm super happy to talk about socio-technical blindness. So this was a term that actually came up in the work, in the research work that I was doing when I was looking at language. And socio-technical blindness actually comes from a paper, 2017 paper called Reframing AI Discourse, and it's by two academics named Johnson and Verdecchio. And they really discuss how kind of the multiple roles that humans play in the creation, the design, and the deployment of artificial intelligence. But what they talk about is the kind of blindness and how it's caused major problems. And kind of the first thing is that many people think about when they think about artificial intelligence, they think about this kind of AI as being really uncontrollable, right? Because they hear this word autonomous machine. And so they hear this word autonomy and they think about this autonomy as in terms of human autonomy. But they fail to see all of these people, right, that are actually in the background controlling the machine. So one of the reasons that that's really problematic is that it removes human agency from the creation of these machines. And it also, as a result of that, removes accountability, right? So as a result, it's like, oh, it wasn't all of these people's fault, it was the machine's fault, right? But actually, like, there are people behind the machines that should be taking accountability for their creations. And kind of the second term, the second kind of major issue that this plays leans on the first of what I've just been talking about, is the essential role that humans play in the life and times of machines, essentially. So what so often happens, and the reason they kind of come across this term socio-technical blindness, is that there are all of these people in the background, but all of the screens and all of the machines that we're presented with create a kind of blindness to the people who are in the background. And so we start to not understand and see the huge amounts of agency that people actually have in creating the machines. And again, you know, accountability causes huge challenges. And like, again, like what we were talking about earlier, who do you go to? You feel like, who do I go to raise a concern about this, right? If I have a problem with Facebook, like, how do I lodge a complaint? Or, you know, because it's just a massive organization and the only thing I know how to engage with Facebook is through the app or through Instagram or through some of their other like kind of products that they create. So that is this idea of socio-technical blindness and how it sort of presents itself in our research that we do.
That's fascinating also. And this brings up something that I love to talk about on this series, and that is what we've been kind of harping on for the last 45 minutes, and the need for diversity when you are creating the different ML products or AI products, and how we shouldn't feel like it's only tech people that need to be involved in this. And there are roles for others that are not coding. And so maybe in you all's experience, you can talk a little bit about different ways that you feel other people besides the engineers can get involved in these development processes, as we have been talking about, like artists that are giving better images, right? That's one way that is very concrete and very, very important. And as we've been mentioning, but other ways that people who are not in tech, or I shouldn't say in tech, but people who are not actually writing the code can be part of the design process.
So I mean, there's been a real rise, obviously, in diversity and inclusivity training and diversity and inclusivity officers. So I think from that standpoint, it would be good to kind of start to include figures like that are trying to really understand how to make their organizations more diverse and inclusive as a whole, and then how that can be reflected in whatever they're putting out to the public. So whether that's the branding or the advertising, things like that. Lisa and I did look at, and are still looking at with the project, how gender is treated in these AI visuals, how race is treated in these AI visuals. And in terms of gender, it was actually a bit split in terms of what the robot was. Was it male or was it female? Was it gender neutral? Which we were kind of surprised by. But the actual sort of figure of it and the racial characteristics were very much Caucasian on a whole. So, it was this kind of classicist sort of approach to designing the body, not really particularly interesting and very much based on white bodies. So I think that has to change anyway, because that's not relatable. It just puts it again puts these images in the category of seeming like they have no depth and they're not relatable and they don't really show what we need them to show for this day and age. But I don't know, Lisa, what do you think in terms of, so I think definitely sociologists, I would say the diversity inclusivity officers, artists, obviously. Who else would you think too?
I think there's a really interesting rise of digital humanities and technology teams that are now being recognized. And, I think I've been really pleasantly surprised and thrilled to see the number of user researchers who are actually entering the field of technology and are now being employed more and more in tech teams. I think, user experience designers, and especially those who have accessibility training to think about like additional needs that their user base may have. If we think about, accessibility, not just from a medical model, but from a social model, and think about the additional needs that somebody might have, like whether that's a situational need or just a temporal need, somebody breaking their arm, right? Like how do you design for that person, or somebody who is in a very busy restaurant and needs to take a call? That's a situational need that they have, that where accessibility can come into play. I would love to see more anthropologists and more sociologists being hired in technical teams to better understand culture, to better understand society, and to be able to work with technologists, not just on the user research piece, which is very much focused very much on that kind of individual one-to-one, individual user testing, but thinking much more about like the societal needs. How do we design for a community? How do we design for a society, which is quite different to some of the methodologies that user researchers adopt. And part of the sociological and anthropological work is thinking about that unintended consequences once we launch the product, right? So let's think about like, when we launch this product, like what are the different kinds of systems that this technology is going to interact with, and what are the potential like outcomes that we are going to see, and how do we mitigate some of the risk that that potentially might come up, during this launch. And then I think a role that I would like to see more of, that I think is slowly starting to filter through, is in the space of philosophy, actually, and seeing philosophers being hired a bit more to consider some of those bigger existential questions that we need to start asking ourselves about the relationship with technology, about the relationship that we're going to have with robots, the impact that technology will have on our moral characters, how to design moral machines, indeed, if it is even possible to design moral machines. Thinking about data and, some of the questions that come up around data and its role in shaping how we know the world, and how we come to know new things about the world, and how do we talk about that. So those are some of the new sort of like digital humanities degrees, I think, and roles that will be in tech, but not necessarily technical.
Yeah, it's funny you say the sociologist and also the philosopher, and thinking about ways that we, especially when it comes to a philosopher, ways that we interact with tech, and then also where should we not be putting tech? Like, where's that line of
Yeah.
it? I think I talked to somebody who was mentioning we don't want to have a robot be giving news to someone that they have cancer, right? There are some things that need that human touch, and so that's the role of a philosopher and potentially some of these other roles that you were speaking of, and to decide like where that line is and what still needs that human touch. And because we're moving very quickly into that
Mm,
direction, right? And I know
mm,
that there are some places that have robots that are being like outpatient care, and they're trying to help with different aspects of the health system. And so you really need to start looking at as you mentioned, the unintended consequences of those different parts that we wouldn't think of until later it happens. And then when it happens, we realize maybe that's not the best user experience. And so it's and the last thing I'll say on that, which I find fascinating, is trying to design for a community as opposed to just designing for one person is something that I hadn't thought about before, and how that would change the design and when you are creating these different systems. So what else I wanted to touch on, and you mentioned, Anne, and you talked about the ways that robots are portrayed, and they are normally portrayed as with the Caucasian body. And I'm just wondering, like, if we actually put time and energy into creating interesting images, like, I feel like the robot is just going to be taken out of the picture completely. Or is that just an assumption that I have? Do you feel like that also?
I mean, I think that would be nice in many, many scenarios, especially because the robots that are shown aren't exactly what robots are in real life either, right? I mean, we do have obviously the figurative robots in some aspects, and a lot of that is portrayed through entertainment. And then, of course, like Lisa and I were talking about Sophia also earlier, of this kind of robot that needs to be figurative. But there are studies of how people relate to a figure, right? Like something that has human characteristics. And Lisa, remind me, because this is more on a technological thing. So what is it, the valley of what, where you kind of go too far in the human aspects and then it becomes
yeah.
weird. And then if you go
Uncanny
too
valley.
low, exactly. And
Yeah.
I don't think that we're going to release from figurative kind of representation, because I think there's still a relatability factor with it. But I think that the robot itself will become less about this kind of, where do we pull from classical Greek, Roman sculpture and art history and transform this into a body that means nothing. And I think it will become something that's maybe more related to what we actually see around us. At least I
Like the
hope.
Roomba.
Yeah,
Like,
exactly. Like the
like
Roomba.
people forget that that's a robot, right? Like people
Or
forget, like, yeah,
yeah, or like Amazon Echo, or all that kind of
yeah,
stuff. Like,
yeah,
and actually
totally.
the other part of is seeing believing is, so we're looking at all these visuals and how we respond to visuals. But the second part of this project, which we haven't even begun to be able to start because we feel like there's so much there, is actually the non-visual and the listening. So how do you feel when you talk to one of these AI objects and it talks back to you? Like, what is that? What are the questions that you're asking? Like, how are you going to relate to that? How do you feel about that kind of technology? Because voice activation technology is just on the rise. And whether people are afraid that it's collecting their data and using it, in a lot of ways, a lot of people aren't caring. They're still wanting to embrace this technology and use it. I mean, we've seen this earlier with Siri, and now we see it with these other sort of devices. But that's in the future. That's the next part of our project. We still have a
And
lot
like,
of visuals to do.
yeah. And, Anne and I were talking about, like, exactly that, taking this kind of outcomes approach and thinking about use cases. When we think about
Mm.
artificial intelligence, we think about, the kind of like the move towards voice activated AI. And we're like, wow, that's such an interesting challenge for designers, right? And for visual communication professionals. Like, how do you visually depict something that is heard and not seen, right? And so, and like very much at the moment, like we're talking about have this very reductionist approach to thinking around, like, okay, artificial intelligence is a robot, therefore have a robot, or at the very the least, like to take that one step up, we're going to have a brain, right, to kind of depict intelligence.
Show intelligence.
But when it comes, and so now when it comes to things like voice activated AI, how do we depict that, right? Because it's not a robot, and it's it's much more. It feels feels weird to depict a speaker in your house or a speaker in your car as a brain. So it's going to be really interesting to start like that sort of next challenge around visually depicting the heard and the not kind of necessarily seen. Yeah.
Oh, totally. There's so many, and it's so funny. And you mentioned that, like, how do we feel when we're interacting with them? And usually, for me, I was just thinking, like, 7 or 8 times out of 10 when I'm talking to Siri, I usually feel frustrated because she doesn't understand me, or it doesn't understand me. And it brings up a question that I've thought about a lot too. And it's almost like a thought experiment with, like, should you be kind to these robots when you're talking to them? Or does it not matter? And I'm under the belief, like, yeah, just be like yourself, and however that is, you are to the robot. But I know some people, like my mom, who will say, like, thank you to Siri. And I always laugh at that.
But I think
like,
that's
Mom,
sweet,
what?
because I think we're not very nice to the technology we talk to. I mean, if you think of calling customer service at the bank or whatever, you're just constantly saying representative, representative, representative. And then under your breath, you're like, I don't care, don't give me 20 options kind of thing. And I think the like politesse of that is out the window in a lot of ways. And even if I think a lot of with the voice activated technology, from my own observations, is people kind of start with it almost like a novelty, where it's kind of fun, it's a little bit of a joke. And then if it doesn't do exactly what you ask, if that was a human, you would maybe joke about it. I mean, maybe you would get mad about it depending on the situation, but almost every time you get very frustrated, like you were talking about, and you don't necessarily talk to it from a place of kindness. And to Lisa's point of kind of these bigger existential questions that we're going to have to ask ourselves later, and this idea of bringing in philosophers, is the more we sort of progress this technology and the more relationships we developed with technology in whatever form, how should we treat the robot with kindness? Like, how do we kind of develop this relationship that may in some instances replace that of a human? So whether it's customer service or whatever else, what is the bigger impact of that later? How is that going to affect us? Lisa was talking about measuring the impact of things. I think that's really important. How we talk to technology now, we might not think of it as something that matters, but in 50 years' time, I think it will mirror how we talk to others as well. I think we've seen this with how people
Totally.
talk to each other on social media, even, where you are still
Yeah.
talking to a human, but you're doing it through this technological channel. And I think it's a really interesting question, and it's a really interesting thing to think about. But I don't necessarily practice what I preach, because I'm definitely yelling at like customer service or robots or whatever. And it's a very instinctual thing, because I don't think it has any feelings and I don't think it cares. But what if it does later? I don't know. But I think it's a big question, and maybe we should all just be
Well, and you
nicer.
bring up a huge point, is that, yeah, we start out now by just talking to our phones like that, but who knows, in 50 years, we could be conditioning ourselves to be talking like that. And it's very hard to get out of that and switch.
Mhm.
Okay, now I'm talking to a robot, so I can be really frustrated and whatever, it doesn't have feelings and it doesn't care. And then we go and we talk to our spouse and we are still in that mode, or we aren't able to switch. And so that is really an interesting thought on, again, on these unintended consequences that we have to look at and we have to be very vigilant of
I think
right
so.
now.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, I think there's a really interesting thing there around, if we look to the future and we think about each of us having our own personal AI and how you need to train that AI, right? So training that AI will be kind of akin to raising a child, really. And so, the more you want from that AI, the more you need to engage with it in an appropriate manner in order for it to learn from you. And in order for it to be able to kind of tailor its results to you, right? So there is something about that sort of relationship that you invest, the time that you invest in that relationship with that machine, with that artificial intelligence, and the kind of value that you will get in return, because AI has so much machine learning built into it, right? That it's learning from you, and that's what will make it better or worse for you potentially in the future.
What is it? Garbage in, garbage out.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
totally.
I would use a different word than garbage, but
Oh, that is a great one. Well, I think this is a perfect segue into the last question that I like to ask every guest. And so, Lisa, I'll start with you. Are you a robot?
No, I'm definitely a human.
All right, and Anne?
I'm definitely human. Yeah, way too complex for a robot.
Oh, Anne, that was great.
Well, I love being able to sit down and talk with you both. You make my job easy. You're so great to talk to, and it is very, very fascinating to hear about what you are doing with Seeing is Believing. We're going to link to all of that and everything that you're doing in the show notes. And if anyone wants to find out more about the project, is there a specific place that you would tell them to go?
I think contact us if you'd like to know more.
Yeah, which I think, and if Lisa, that's still fine with you, I've sort of gathered most of it from my company's general email address. And then Lisa and I always discuss whatever comes in. So that is just info@culture-a.com.
Perfect. Well, thanks again, and we will see you later. Have a great day, everyone that is listening.
Thank you so much. That's been great.